Well, hello again, 2025. Some new lecture casts for you, some new ideas, observations in our coffee table chat series. So happy to be with you today. I just love to thank Captioning Services. They really work so hard to get everything together for me, for us. Wonderful partnership, excellent services. They never disappoint. Anyhow, my dears, you see, I have up for you a picture of one of my all-time favorite games, Pac-Man. And I want to talk today a little bit about literature, cultural studies, gaming, and really an observation I have for you based on gaming, television, and literature. I'm going to do it all for you today. So I hope you stay with me and you enjoy what I'm about to share with you. So anyway, back in my day, that day feels like so long ago, but it really wasn't, you know? Back in my day, this Pac-Man machine, just like I have it here in the picture, it really became so popular in the early 1980s. I started seeing them in pizzerias, in arcades, saw them at the airport, all kinds of places. Uh, we had stores similar to Walmart in the 1980s in the region where I went to college, high school, stores like something called Gold Circle, James Way, Ames. Anyway, for a quarter, you could really like have this whole other dimension, for you to have skill, to have enjoyment, entertainment, to de-stress, uh, to sort of, have another form of maybe an outlet just to keep your mind off things, some kind of a social distraction. The arcade, and sometimes where these machines were located, still are, by the way. Sometimes I see these machines. It was social. You met other people who enjoyed playing the game. They enjoyed comparing score. They enjoyed comparing different modalities and movements of the joystick, etc. So that's why I have this little picture up today to really just get us into this discussion, this observation. And so I think to myself about video games and the whole situation with gaming. Long time ago, when I first became a parent, gaming really wasn't so popular with my daughter. My daughter's now going to be 37. It just really didn't take off with her friends when she was, you know, a child, preschool, school age. It just wasn't a thing for girls, and I look at it in this perspective of gender and women, gender, sexuality studies, all of these different aspects of what it is that we feed girls, what it is that we feed boys for entertainment, for reading, all these historical factors. When my daughter was young and her cohorts, that's who I have to judge by, I really didn't hear much about video games. I don't really remember them playing Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man often, Millipede, Centipede. Those were the big ones. Mario just really didn't seem to reach young girls at the time, 1980s, 1990s. I think about that in my own life when I was young, school age. Most of the comics, the Marvel comics, as we knew them, usually featured men or boys and or male persons, persona, archetypal image. And the men could do all these amazing things. They could run into a phone booth, they could put on a cape, they could fly, they could, defy kryptonite. They could do all these wonderful things. And back in my day, similarly, there wasn't really a lot of space and place for women and girls to go into comics. We saw often, you might know the Scooby-Doo, and we saw some of it in Scooby-Doo in the comics as well as on television. We saw women assuming different roles. We saw women asking important questions: who, what, where, when, how, why, solving mysteries. I remember we saw back in my day, we had something called the Nancy Drew series. And Nancy Drew had this character. She was a character. And every series, every new story had some little mystery that she was going to solve. So that was an important portal for young women and girls, people that are probably your grandmother and your mother's age. we had that first taste, you know? So, of course, we had the Scooby-Doo, we had Nancy Drew series, but we didn't have too much until 1970s came along. We had Wonder Woman. Now she was interesting, Wonder Woman. She had all these tights, very tight clothing, but it wasn't sexual. She wasn't sexualized. So that was like unusual for us as a dynamic in media, entertainment. It was an unusual message for her. She was very pretty. Wonder Woman was very pretty, very athletic, could do all these wonderful things, and both men and women looked to her to solve great mysteries, to provide protection, etc. So it was sort of a new character for us. Similarly, Charlie's Angels, which at one time was also a cartoon, that started to appeal to women and girls. These were three dynamic uh, women who were detectives, private investigators, etc. And every single show in the series on television, they faced new challenges. They faced danger. They faced all kinds of sexualized situations that they use their sexuality when necessary to foil attempts by, usually nefarious men. And so that was an interesting message. That was a little something different for the young woman, the young girl. I remember I was in my teens when Charlie's Angels came out, and none of us really ever saw that role before. We didn't understand those roles as easily as we would understand today. We would say, you mean attractive and intelligent and sexy and sexualized and could save the day. This was like new to us, you know? And then I think to myself, in looking historically as it relates to literary and cultural studies, I think to myself about the show Bewitched. Now, that was an interesting show, came out in the 1960s, and she was very pretty. She was also a mother, so very familiar themes, very familiar characters to these traditional conventional roles of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And so in Bewitched, the mother happened to have had these supernatural powers, which she really it was a comedic show. It wasn't a drama. It didn't have any dark undertones, but it was always a good laugh. But you took the character Sam very seriously because if she didn't like something or didn't feel it was appropriate, she fixed it by wiggling her nose with the superpower, and then she would have it the way she liked it. And she would engineer and masterfully deal with activities of daily living by restructuring things with her superpowers. Of course, she gave birth to a daughter named Tabitha, and Tabitha, of course, inherited the superpowers. So you see, that show spoke to so many different generations because it spoke to the grandparent, it spoke to the parent, then it spoke to the child. Of course, how did it influence me on so many levels? It influenced me as I did what? I did what all the other girls did that were my age at the time that were so influenced by the show that in the 1980s, one of the most popular names was Tabitha. Of course, I named my daughter Tabitha. Sorry about the dogs barking. I named my daughter Tabitha because I was so influenced by this show that a woman could change the scope and trajectory of her day, household chores by just wiggling her nose and she could get out of it. It just fascinated me and hundreds of thousands of women and girls my age across the country. And therefore, I guess that was the impetus, the catalyst in naming all these hundreds of thousands of new babies in the 1980s Tabitha. Anyhow, we move along. I think to myself about Pac-Man. When Pac-Man first came out, we knew nothing about Miss Pac-Man. We just knew we assumed, I guess, that Pac-Man was a boy. There was nothing that said Pac-Man's a boy, Pac-Man's a girl. I guess we just made that assumption. Then we had it validated for us that Pac-Man happened to be a girl. She had some kind of little extra design. She had little hearts with her. Sometimes she had a little dress depending on who designed the game. And this was supposed to draw us in as the market. We really didn't know much about the character. I don't think we cared much about the character. We just were delivered a character that now was a girl, Ms. Pac-Man. Okay. So I think about all these video games. I think historically how far we've come. look at something like Grand Theft Auto. I think about Grand Theft Auto frequently. I have another son. His name's TJ. Anyway, when TJ was young, he wanted Grand Theft Auto. And of course, we had all kinds of people in politics that said that the video games were going to be the demise of our existence and humanity. They were going to brainwash children. They were going to become addictive. They did nothing to promote self-worth, etc. And I remember Grand Theft Auto when it first came out, I said to my son, one day, what did you do after school today? And he said, well, he said, you're going to be so proud of me. I ran over prostitutes. At first, I thought he was kidding. And then I said, what? He said, you know that game you bought me? I said, yeah. He said, well, there's a dimension in the game and there's this theme, etc. And I really didn't know what he was talking about till I went to see the game myself that I had purchased. And I realized that video games move far beyond just maybe taking score, keeping points, etc. The thrill of the game itself, something to do as a digress from everyday life, maybe to relax. I realized that the games had a little more depth. They talked about social issues. They, unfortunately, some of the games started making sociological strata. Who was worth living, who isn't worth living. That bothered me a little. But I got over it. I understand. And it has to do with the character development. These video games really evolved. They now have plot twists. They have anatomy of character. They have thematic structure. I think to myself, if I was a gaming person, what would Romeo and Juliet look like if we had a game where we try to get them both to a safe place at a safe time? What would that video game look like? How would the ending be for them? How far could they run away from the moat? I don't know. We look at video games that we have today, plots, etc., archetypal, friends, foes. What would a video game look like today if it was designed, fashioned after fables, or if it was designed after nursery rhymes? you know, to look at it that way. There used to be this, I wouldn't call it video game, but back in the 1990s, there was a big argument in education about something called Reader Rabbit. I don't know if any of you know Reader Rabbit, but it was very popular in the place and time for where we were with gaming and educational solutions to getting children to have more screen time so they could learn how to be more engaged in sit and seat, etc., have some kind of interaction relationship with characters. And so we had this program called Reader Rabbit. I was a big fan of Reader Rabbit. I still am. And Reader Rabbit simply was a reading tool methodology where you could do a lot of pointing, clicking with the mouse, tapping on the pad, etc., having that necessary eye hand coordination, which I think is very valuable. I think many people didn't understand that it wasn't only a playtime resolution and attainment of basic skills. I think for many children, Reader Rabbit was really the very beginning of our culture understanding and accepting new technologies and new ways to reach characterization and hold attention for young persons who are trying to learn new skills. I think it's wonderful. I still do think it's wonderful. I think often as well about where we are today with gaming, how many parents often say gaming has ruined, how it is that children play, how it is that they relate to one another, how it is that they're spending their time, etc. And I don't think so. I think today gaming is very, very sophisticated, especially in character development, especially in being in a place where we can look at empathy. We can say, well, again, this idea of being self-reflected, to be relational, self-relational, to say, if this happened to me, which temporarily it does, if somebody assumes a character, how would I act this out? How would I make my maneuvers? How would I take this electronic world, gaming world, and take what it is that I act out there in a positive manner and put it into my larger context? how it is that we see characters derive relationships from one another, I think is also important. I also think, as far as literary community, I think it is wonderful when people spend time, especially children, in a positive situation where they can form communities online of people that like to talk about a particular character, a particular theme, a particular dialogue, a particular archetype. I think that that's wonderful. We see this too with anime. When people have a particular storyboard that they enjoy, I think that there's a primary and a secondary place for this in the canon of literature. You know, like I say, we relied so heavily in many other centuries in being able to have books and to have like a couple personal pieces in a library because there was no other entertainment. There was no other ability to transport somebody's mind and spirit, even for 15, 20 minutes at a time, to transport into another world, you know? And here, video games, I think, also offer the ability to transport, to entertain, to educate, to have social emotional development. I think it's very important. I see cartoons also as a way to transport, to take somebody from one place in time into another. Same with the television show, same thing with the movie of the week. I think that persons probably in my generation, I was born in the 60s, 1960s, maybe we need to expand our view on what should be considered in the canon of literature, how it is that we receive information, and how it is that we interact with information. I remember politically, somewhere around 1998 to about 2005, there were these huge movements in the educational system in our country and in Congress to ban a variety of gaming. I remember that there were many movements that talked about censorship and gaming. I remember there were many people that said, I remember them specifically in graduate school that said gaming, this is funny, I mean, I'm laughing as I tell you this, that gaming was a very temporary thing and it was a fad and it would soon play itself out. Well, we've learned otherwise, right? It's certainly not a fad. I think too, TikTok, social platforms, places where we get stories, you know? I'm going to talk for a moment before I leave you for the day. It's so beautiful out here today. I wish you were here with me. It looks like little cotton balls are flying through the air, but nothing seems to be sticking. I love my snow. Anyhow, I think to myself often about platforms, how many things I've learned on TikTok uh, reels, how many things I've learned in just watching 30-second reels, how many things I've learned through the dynamic of watching educational television. Look at the Food Channel. We really didn't have food channels when I was growing up. We had some advertisements that talked about, you know, the Oreo cookie, these paradigms, the Oreo cookie, the chocolate chip cookie, Chips Ahoy. We didn't have a lot of interaction in media at my place and time. Today, I can put on all kinds of building shows. I can get my literature through watching television, self-help. I can get all kinds of things, all kinds of material. It just, we have to sort of grow. This is my thinking, that we have to sort of grow with these new technologies that are afforded to us. There are so many countries. I know this for a fact. I work with quite a few international people, like in Somali and in other parts of Africa on this continent. There are no video games. There really are no reels. There is no internet. Or in countries like Cuba, certain parts of Turkey, uh, different parts of Eastern Europe, Romania, parts of China, a lot of media is censored. What people take for granted as far as what we have in information, attaining information, enjoying information, information for the purpose of education, etc. A lot of other countries have really taken it away from their citizens or have limited it greatly or have made tremendous restrictions. And I say, you know, how unfortunate, you know, so I am willing, you know, just as a person, part of humanity, human landscape, I'm a person that says, I'm willing to take the little bad that comes from the majority of the good as it relates to having all these different mediums and genres, whether it's, again, found in gaming, found in all kinds of online storytelling. You know, I remember when I was a young adult, like maybe 25 years old, something like that. So that would be 1980s. I remember books on tape was such a big deal. Everybody said, so many people in my circle said, well, that's not the same as reading. Books on tape, not the same as reading. You don't get the same experience if somebody tells you the story. Of course, you get a similar experience. Maybe not the same experience in laying down with a book, the physical nature of holding the book, but it certainly is the same experience in it, being able to attain knowledge. Look what happened during COVID. Remember, COVID knocked on our door about 5 years ago, you know, and so many people were relegated to being in the house and doing virtual learning, online learning like we are today in this medium. And people say, well, that's not real learning. Of course, it's real learning. You know, very often in film studies, which when I was in college, film studies really wasn't a popular genre. It really wasn't a popular medium because people said, one time I went to the new school. I went to NYU very briefly. I went to Oswego, and everybody said, "Well, film studies is not an academic study." I said, "What do you mean film studies is not an academic study? What's the difference if I read Glass Menagerie or I view Glass Menagerie? Really, what is the difference?" You know, maybe I don't have the notes from the playwright regarding props, but I can visually see the props. What's the difference if I don't read Glass Menagerie, if I don't view Glass Menagerie, and if I listen to Glass Menagerie? I still get the picture. So I really do argue that we have evolved. We have to continue to evolve. I think podcast has delivered for us another appropriate means in the delivery of education and entertainment. Certainly it relates to the non-traditional methods. I'm all for it. I think it's wonderful. I think it has a place in society. I'm glad that we have it without any restrictions, etc. So I'm thrilled to be here with you today to share these very brief observations. We will talk more, whether it's in assignments, in classroom, chat, etc. We will have some assignments that do point us to gaming, television, and all of those extra mediums that we have. We will continue to discuss. I wish you well always. All blessings to you. And thank you for the time that you took to spend with me in listening to this little conversation. I wish you well always. Bye bye.